Today, we're going to speak a lot about one of my favorite texts, the Ribhu Gita. Now, the Ribhu Gita is actually one of Bhagavan's favorite texts as well. And there are two versions of this. You can see this one. This is a big boy. And so there's the Sanskrit translation and there's also the Tamil translation. Now, I have both the Tamil and the Sanskrit. Today, we're going to explore the original Sanskrit, even though I love the Tamil as well. And like I said, this was one of Ramana's favorite texts. And this is one I actually highly recommend for all of you to read. It's a longer contemplation than, let's say, the Ashtavakra Gita or the Avadhuta Gita. The Ribhu Gita is a sustained contemplation on the self, on the Atman, which is Brahman. So when we talk about the Ribhu Gita is actually it's Ribhu himself was a sage and was given the knowledge of Brahman from Shiva himself. So that's the way that the story goes. And so Ribhu is teaching his disciple Nadaga about the nature of everything, right? The nature that Atman is Brahman. So he got the revelation from Shiva himself. This is the way that the story actually goes. And so the text itself actually relates to Ramana, because when Ramana had his realization at the age of 16, he head for the holy mountain of Arunachala in Tiruvannamalai in South India, and threw all his money away, put on a loincloth, and resided at the holy mountain for the rest of his life. He never actually went 3 kilometers away from Arunachala. So a beautiful story in and of itself. But when Ramana got there, he didn't really quite, we could say, intellectually understand his realization. He knew that he had some type of awakening. You know, you got to remember he's a young man at this stage, a young boy actually at 16. And so he didn't quite understand intellectually his awakening, right? And so in the preface of the Ribhu Gita, the one that I have here, the Sanskrit from Ramana Ashram in Tiruvannamalai, Ramana says, I did not yet know that there was an essence or impersonal real underlying everything, and that God and I were both identical with it. Later at Tiruvannamalai, as I listened to the Ribhu Gita and other sacred books, I learnt all this and found that they were analyzing and naming what I had felt intuitively without analysis or name. As he said there, the experience he felt without analyzing. So the Ribhu Gita gave him the answer as he listened to these texts. And a lot of people, what they make a mistake of is that they think that Ramana actually never studied the scriptures. He never listened to satsangs from older swamis when he arrived in Tiruvannamalai. And that's all not true. Ramana did. Ramana actually, his uncles were Brahmins, right? And so he was pretty well versed in Vedic scripture. And so by the time he got to Tiruvannamalai, he was pretty well versed. But these higher texts, like the Ribhu Gita and say the Ashtavakra and the Avadhuta, some of his favorite texts, he had never come across those teachings. And so he came across those teachings, and the Ribhu really made sense to him, right? It made sense. But it told him, as I said in that quote, it told him what actually his experience was, right? And so he said that I learned all this and found they were analyzing and naming what I felt intuitively without analysis or name, which I find beautiful, right? That's so beautiful that he had that experience. And the realization that he had was verified by a great scripture like the Ribhu Gita, right? And so you could say Ribhu himself is a type of Bhagavan figure, just like Ramana. And so the whole text is like Ramana's life, when Ramana would always explain to devotees that ultimately they are Brahman, right? You can say this or that and pretend in the jiva, the persona system as much as you like, but ultimately you are that. And in the Ribhu is actually explained to Nadaga, his disciple, that constantly that you are that, you are that. Throughout the Ribhu Gita, actually, it can get repetitive, particularly if you read the Tamil translation. It's very forceful in the sense that I am Shiva, I am that, I am Shiva, I am that. And so like it goes through sometimes this repetitive stanza format, which was very common in India a long time ago. You even find this in Buddhist scriptures, right? A lot of texts, you got to remember, were written in ancient times as a meditative tool, which a lot of people forget about in the modern day. They were written as a meditative tool. And so we would read the Ribhu Gita, we would read the Ashtavakra or the Avadutta or text of this nature as a meditative tool, right? And so I think that what you get in the modern days, you get a lot of new age competitive spiritual people, right? We see a lot of them in the YouTube comment section trying to compete with each other, maybe the non-dual police, who forget that the scriptures are a meditative tool. They're supposed to be there to use for your own personal meditation, to understand the higher nature, obviously. But the reading of the scripture itself is a meditative tool, which a lot of people forget. In that fashion, right, in the fashion that Ramana had a realization, he had a particular mentality, he had an attitude for spirituality that I think a lot of people miss in the modern day. Maybe because they are new age spiritualists and they are competing with other people. I don't know why. I don't quite understand that mentality. You need to keep a mentality of humility, listen and learn, and never think you're above anyone else. And don't take yourself too seriously either, right? I think often people get into spirituality and they take themselves too seriously, or they might inquire into the who am I inquiry, and then they obsess about themselves constantly, right? And so then it becomes the ego questioning itself. You're actually not in pure awareness. You're not just observing yourself without the question, right? Because that's the stage you need to get to. The question evaporates because the who, there is no who. The question should be, what am I? Not who am I, right? So we study the scriptures, we follow our spiritual path to understand the what am I, but you don't obsess about that. Once the penny drops, right, on the spiritual path, once it drops, then all questions disappear. The inquiry becomes more of a silent inquiry into your own nature and doesn't become a mind game of constantly asking, who is the one that likes pizza? Who is the one that doesn't like Sunday afternoon before work? So forth and so on. You get my drift, right? So I think a lot of people obsess about that, which is a big, big problem. And that's actually what inhibits people's spiritual path. One of the main practices on the spiritual path, or one of the main mentalities that you need to have, no matter whether you are a Vedantist, a Buddhist, even a Christian or a Muslim, is having what Zhuangzi said is Shao Yao Yu. So free and easy wandering or aimless roaming, right? This sense of ease. If you don't have this sense of ease, it means that you live in a lot in your mind and you're overthinking about a lot of things, which is the height of the ego, right? And so the inquiry, Atma Vichara, can sometimes become that with a devotee or a disciple, is they can begin to obsess about themselves constantly and constantly question, who am I, who am I, who am I? And the inquiry becomes actually an obstacle because you don't have Shao Yao Yu, which is one of the higher teachings on the spiritual path. Because if you don't have that fundamental ease, you will not go far on the spiritual path. That is a fact. That is just a fact that a lot of people have to deal with. And so cultivating that ease, having that ease allows you to go deeper into these teachings. So then you won't take yourself too seriously. You won't be competing with people in the YouTube section to, flex your spiritual virtue, so to speak. Virtue signaling has become, sadly, a thing in spirituality. But on my channel and with my work, what we are doing here is we're teaching traditional spiritual knowledge. What I like to say, real spirituality for real and sincere people. And so getting back to the Ribhu Gita, as I was saying, there are parts in this today which are going to speak about the path for all spiritual aspirants, right? Like how I mentioned Ramana's mentality and his attitude towards the spiritual path, what is required of us too on the spiritual path that a lot of people forget about. Doesn't mean you have to go to a cave and sit in a cave all the time, right? But you need a certain level of bodhicitta, right? Bodhicitta meaning a certain level of enthusiasm and eagerness for the path, for spirituality itself, which I think a lot of people forget and neglect. And so let's go to the next section of the Ribhu Gita, right? So as I said, the mentality of the spiritual aspirant, what parts of it we need to understand. And we'll go further into this. The first verse we see, the spiritual aspirant is unperturbed by the challenges of the worldly life. He is of the conviction that he is unattached. In due course, he matures to the state he sees the movement of senses into their objects as their nature, and that he has nothing to do with that. One's well being and liberation lie in one's own dharma, spiritual path, even if it might appear as an inferior one. One should never forsake one's dharma in favor of an alien path. Again, a spiritual aspirant should be unperturbed by worldly life, right? Unperturbed by the dramas of the world. You have to cultivate what is that sense of vairagya, right? That sense of worldly dispassion and kind of non-reactiveness to what is going on in the world around you. And we only have to think about this really logically, right? We only have to think about how much can we actually influence in life. If something is happening on the other side of the planet, is it natural for us to overthink about that? Is it natural for us to get involved in that when the reality of having access to what is happening on the other side of the world is a relatively new phenomenon? We lived most of our evolution as a human species without that. So things were happening in South America that people in Africa did not know about, right? And so this has been the way it has always been until recently. And then we take on the burdens of the world, we take on the burdens of our neighbors, and then we're constantly consumed with the burdens that we have within ourselves. And so we can't progress on the path. You need to have that sense of vairagya. And so in the Ribhu is saying to actually Nadaga that you need to overcome the challenges of worldly life. You really do. You have to have a certain level of vairagya. It doesn't mean you're heartless. Obviously, our heart goes out to all people who suffer injustice or might have their life taken early, and we don't know why that is. Obviously, we're human beings. Our heart does go out to them. But if you were consumed by all of that, what would that do to you, right? If all of the problems in the world right now, if they were just in a vacuum sucked into your mind, imagine your head would just explode. There is that many problems. There are people who have their life cut short for no good reason from our perspective anyway. Maybe there is a divine reason, but you don't want to be overly consumed with that. And so that becomes an obstacle on the path. And another thing that I like about this particular quote is Ribhu goes into that one's well-being and liberation lie in one's own dharma, spiritual path. Even if it might appear as an inferior one should never forsake one's dharma in favor of an alien path. Now, this is very important because I think a lot of people try to embody or take on the spiritual path of somebody else when the path for them is set out for them. We all have our own dharma. And if we understand that truly, which we'll get into later, that the will of the ultimate is moving through us as us, then that path is already laid out for us. And the way we understand that is that it's through our intuition, it's through the ease of how something comes to us that becomes our path, right? That becomes our path. When it feels effortful and when we're trying to, let's say, keep up with the Joneses or trying to be like somebody else, then it becomes an alien path to us. And then it becomes very difficult to follow. And so that becomes also an obstacle, which Ribhu is explained to Nadaga. And this is why Bhagavan himself would say to the devotees, because when the devotees would come to see Ramana, right, they would sit with him in that pristine silence. And then when it came time for satsang, they too wanted to experience that, right? They too wanted to be like an enlightened jnani, like Bhagavan. But you got to remember, Ramana was very humble, right? He would always eat last with the devotees. There were a lot of things about him because he had that humility which shone. And this is like why I always say to people, if you don't have that humility at the beginning and at the end of the spiritual path, then you won't progress anywhere on the spiritual path because all the great masters had it. But getting back to my point, Ramana would say to the devotees that, no, you don't need to sit here at Arunachala and be in silence. You can still be a householder. You can still be a mother and a father or a daughter or a son and live your life, but live it with the grace of Shiva, right? By following your own personal dharma. Bhagavan's dharma was to get on a train from his small town and go to Arunachala. And we are blessed to have all come across him. But we also are blessed in following our own dharma, right? And so sometimes we can also exaggerate the guru, right? And that becomes a problem in and of itself too, particularly because when Eastern spirituality went west. There can be a lot of celebrity culture around guruism, right? There becomes this Hollywood syndrome. Now, obviously, we're here today celebrating Ramana, and we are all blessed to have come across these teachings. But why I'm saying that is because we too can forget ourselves, and then we take on the path of the guru, which is an alien path, right? It doesn't mean you don't listen to the guru. The guru is a guide on your path. But if you take on the path of the guru, or you take on how they are, then that can be an alien path too. And it might not be a suit that fits, right? And so that's also something for us to think about, is not being influenced by someone else's path, following what comes easy to you. And remember, none of us here are better than anyone else. We're all human beings fundamentally. Even the guru is a human being, right? First and foremost. But they've had the realization and the recognition that they are Brahman alone. And most of us haven't. And so we follow our paths sometimes in ignorance. And then when I say ignorance here, I mean avidya in Sanskrit, right? The ignorance of Brahman. So majority of people in the world are living in ignorance because they don't know that Brahman alone exists. Oneness is the only reality. And so we often get so engaged in worldly affairs that we forget that, right? And so what Ribhu is stating here is that if we are steadfast to our path and we don't take on an alien path and we follow our own dharma, and if we're not influenced by worldly attachments, then the chance of moksha, being liberated while living, is possible in living just your ordinary life, right? Not trying to be someone else, not trying to take on an alien path, so forth and so on. And so we'll go to the next verse in relation to the mentality of a spiritual aspirant. So in the realm of world experience, the aspect of sense pleasures appears to be disapproved by the Vedic commandments. However, the texts do make promises of higher states of enjoyments to aspirants. Though unreal and fleeting, these are concessions of solace to those who feel frustrated in their efforts, which, after all, are a walk on the sharp edge of a blade. For persevering, the truth in all simplicity and purity is revealed. It is neither in the enjoyment nor in the enjoyer. Giving one's heart to such enticements will result in a series of transmigrating lives. Now, this is a really important verse. It can put a lot of people off, right? So giving one's heart to such enticements will result in a series of transmigrating lives. And so, as it says, walking on the sharp edge of a blade. And that's really what the spiritual path is, right? You're walking on that sharp edge of a blade where you could go one way or the other, or you could collapse in on yourself. And so you want to think about this in the sense of Kashmiri Shaivism, right? Because in Kashmiri Shaivism, they do not neglect the world, because the world itself is Shakti, right? The manifest world around us, you and I here, is Shakti. It's the power of Shiva, right? And so that's the difference between maybe the Advaitin and the Kashmiri Shaiva, because sometimes the Advaitin can forget other knowledge within Shankara's teachings, where even Ribhu, in the Ribhu Gita himself, acknowledges that sometimes that the manifest world is Shakti, and at other times, the whole world is an illusion. Now, you have to think about that in a certain way. If you don't understand the essence of Maya, the Sanskrit Maya, Ma and Marta, which means measurement. So Maya is essentially the measurement of reality, or the illusion of measurement. It's not an illusion itself per se. It's the illusion of measurement through the subjective vessel, right? So we are measuring the world according to this and that, according to our own conditioning. And so that's what builds the illusion. This is what in Sanskrit is Brahmanda, is like this constructed cultural illusion you have in your mind, right? And so this is what Maya is. Maya is constructing this Brahmanda, this kind of framework that we all have on a subjective level. And that's how we see the world, right? And so we see the world through that lens. We cut the world up into this and that, and we can't see the world purely as it truly is. And so you'll see in the Ribhu Gita, you'll see in the Mandukya Upanishad Kataka and all of these texts where the sages, they'll flip-flop between the world is Shakti, the world is illusion. And so sometimes you see these contradictions in the text. And I'm going to be writing a book about that in the future, which talks a lot about integral Advaita, which I actually think in a lot of sense are the higher teachings, because it's not an actual negation of the world, but you're not exaggerating your place in the world also, right? Which gets back to my point, because like I said, if you're looking at it from a subjective vessel, that's the illusion. If you are thinking that the world itself is an illusion, get someone to slap you in the face or someone to kick you in the groin, right? And you pretty much wake up out of the illusion pretty quick. And so when we talk about the great teachers, when we talk about the great sages, I think that this paradox exists because sometimes there's a lack of admitting that we're human, right? So we want to transcend the human. But if we look at it from like an integral Advaita perspective, if we look at it from Kashmiri Shaivism, if we look at it from Taoism, if we look at it from Vajrayana Buddhism, particularly the Dzogchen traditions, these are non-dual traditions, but there's not the negation of the human, right? You're not neglecting the human experience, but you're also not taking that too far. We're not getting so involved in the enjoyments. So like a tantrika on the Shaiva path, on the Kashmiri Shaiva path, that has been kind of warped, right? Where when Tantrism went west, it became all about sex. It became all about overly enjoying yourself. Now, the original Tantrikas are not saying you overly enjoy yourself. Like you don't go out and have sex 4 times a day, eat a box of Krispy Kreme donuts, go to Burger King at night. You'd be the size of a house. It would be a very dark reality, right? And so they're not saying that. What the Tantrikas were saying in Kashmiri Shaivism is that the world exists, but we don't know why it's here. But the world doesn't exist in the sense of the way that we interpret it through our subjective lens. That's where the problems arise, right? The way we interpret it through our subjective lens is where all the problems arise. And so we need to get out of that habit of always interpreting reality as this or that. You go back to the Zen farmer and son story, right? Where the son kept having fortunate and unfortunate circumstances, and the farmer was always like, we'll see, we'll see. We don't really know why things happen, but they happened, right? And so I think that a lot of the spiritual community, particularly if we're talking about Eastern philosophy and spirituality, is a lot of people get so vexed about, I'm trying to transcend the human, everything is an illusion and this and that. But then when you actually see those people in their ordinary life, you see a lot of hypocrisy because they might behave in a certain way, which is very human, right? And so in Taoism, like Lao Tzu would say, the highest spiritual path is to be actually radically human. Because when you think about it, we've got all these high philosophies, we've got all of these religions and so forth and so on, because we are uncomfortable in some sense with the human experience. So Lao Tzu and the Kashmiri Shaivas would say lean into that human experience and see if there's something through it rather than trying to negate it, because the negation can be an indication also of dualism. And this is why integral Advaita becomes a thing. Sri Ramakrishna himself had a love for Kali, right? Which would seem paradoxical to an Advaita Vedantin to have the love of a deity like that. But when you understand the teachings of Ramakrishna, he was teaching something known as Vijnana Vedanta, right? Which is actually integral non-dualism. And so that's something for us to think about. Even Ramana himself will flip-flop too, through sometimes talking about the Shakti, talking about everything as illusion. And again, if you don't understand the essence of Maya itself in Sanskrit, you'll get lost through this, because it'll be like, well, is the world an illusion, or is it Shakti, or what is it? Now, as I said, it just needs to be clarified. The illusion exists here. What is going on out here? We don't really know what, right? We can say it's a simulation. We can say whatever we want about it. We can create up all sorts of theories, right? And so I like David Deutsch's explanation in the beginning of Infinity, when he talks about, again, he's a physicist, right? He's a scientist. So I don't know much about his spirituality or whatnot. But when you read a lot of his books, which are very difficult to read, he does speak about that all we have are good explanations, right? So when you think about it, right? And so some explanations are better than others. And so why probably you and I and everyone in here resonate with Eastern spirituality and philosophy is because they are the best explanations we have. maybe better than a lot of monotheistic religions and so forth and so on, right? So like I said, you've got to understand there is this reality around you. It is there whether you want to close your eyes or open your eyes. It's still there, right? If you close your eyes, someone slaps you on the face, you kind of open your eyes, you realize, oh, I'm daydreaming, right? But it's there nevertheless, but you don't need to split the atom. You don't need to make anything of it. What you need to do is cleanse the vision. Once you cleanse the vision, that's when Ananda arises in you. That's when the unassociated bliss arises in you, because you've got rid of the associated blisses, right? Associated to your conditioning and this and that. Oh, my football team won, I'm happy. Oh, it lost, I'm sad, so forth and so on. Cleanse the vision, experience Ananda. So let's go on to the next slide. So the attitude of finding faults with others and other faiths should be nipped in the bud. Even an inadvertently permitted lenience in this manner shall cause one's spiritual accomplishment to suffer. Just as a dash of salt can wreck a whole pot of milk, so does this scum of intolerance bring havoc to the aspirant. Consequently, one loses judgment in matters of action, inaction, and non-action. So that attitude, as Ribhu is speaking about here, is about not finding faults with the path of others and not finding faults a lot with the world in general, right? Now, you don't want to take this too far in the sense, you don't want to become a fundamentalist about this quote in and of itself, right? But as Ribhu says here, it can inhibit your spiritual accomplishment. And so that's something we need to think about, because I think a lot of us, as I said before, there's this competitiveness in spirituality now, sadly in Eastern spirituality and philosophy, where people will get into arguments and so forth and so on about things that are literally childish. You know, we are adults here. And so what they're doing is they're measuring themselves against others, right? And sadly in our world, and it's a fundamental psychological flaw, is when people see the success of others, or people see maybe the attainments of others, or so forth and so on, people like to tear them down. It's a fundamental weakness people have in their human psychology, because people don't want people actually to be better than them, right? And so, because people don't want to be left behind. Don't leave me behind. Don't leave me in this kind of spiritual cul-de-sac that I'm in. These are massive problems on the path when we have that attitude of speaking badly about someone's path, speaking badly about someone's religion, and so forth and so on. And look, we live in such a divisive world at the moment because of those silly phones. You know, those stupid things, those phones? So people believe a lot what's on those phones, right? But they don't go outside, listen to a bird, or watch the grass grow. You can actually see the grass grow if you pay attention for a long period of time. But when you get away from these stupid phones, you realize that the world is shanti, really. And people get along. People are actually wonderful. But what's happening in the world is, because of this innate insecurity and competitiveness, the competitiveness comes from the insecurity, right? The person feeling limited because they're operating through their ego, and the ego is fundamentally limited. And so it wants to secure itself. It wants to find a nice home, and it wants to tear other people down around it because it ensures its survival, which is a fundamental trait through evolution, but now it's superimposed onto the psychological, which is a problem. And so when we're doing that and we're trying to bring other people down, we are inhibiting our own spiritual path. And so sadly, because of the phones, there are certain people who will attack certain spiritual paths and religions. Like, for example, Hinduism is constantly attacked by other religions and by progressive media and so forth and so on. It's always under attack because the truth in the tradition threatens the existence of those institutions, right? But you'd also, in turn, for example, if you're a Hindu, you don't want to in turn then become a fundamentalist about it and then start attacking them, because that also is not wisdom. You want to continue to follow your path, and you don't care what they say. Insignificant when you're following your own dharma, right? It's completely insignificant. And so that's the path that we need to follow, especially as spiritual aspirants, right? I remember there's a great dialogue with Bhagavan and the devotees when they're discussing with him politics and Gandhi and these type of matters, right? And Bhagavan, not that he was deflecting it, but he kind of said like Gandhi's a great Jnani and these type of things. And then kind of just said that that's all of their path. Like, who am I to kind of say that I'm any better than them, for example, right? And so that was his point. Like, let's not try and tear other people down, even though in some sense we may disagree with them. And there may be moments in time where you may need to say something. And so you say something when it's necessary, if it's immediate and appropriate and spontaneous, but then you leave it there, right? And so I like to use the word dog psychology, because there are certain places in the world where people have dog psychology. Now, this is not a negative thing. I'm not saying that people are dogs, but dogs can get into a fight and then 5 minutes later, they're sniffing each other's butts. Shanti, peace. For them, dog, for peace, sniffing each other's butt. For us, peace, equanimity of mind. It's a little bit higher than maybe sniffing a butt, right? And I notice this a lot, especially when I visit Tamil Nadu in the south. I've seen people argue, 5 minutes later, they're having a chai. Now, if that was in Australia, there is no 5 minutes later. There's no 5 days later. There's no 5 months later. There's no 5 years later. People hold that to heart. And so we need to have sometimes that dog psychology to move on with their life. Sometimes you can say a certain thing, or sometimes someone can say something to you, but you don't have to take it personally, particularly if you don't live within the ego and you don't live within the jiva, the persona system a lot, right? We often fluctuate between the Atman and the jiva throughout our day, but you don't want to abide in that and take things personally, right? It's like Gurdjieff's grandfather's wisdom, right? Gurdjieff asked his grandfather, just give me some wisdom, because his grandfather was very wise. And he said, look, if someone says something to you, don't react initially. Like if it's something that hurts you, don't react initially. Wait 24 hours and see how you feel about it. Now, he said that it does two things. It kills the ego fundamentally because you want to react in the immediate moment, but it also gives you clarity 24 hours later. Is it something that you need to react to? So, for example, I can use my experience. I get a lot of emails from people, a lot of hateful emails. And so the ego in me naturally wants to say something, but then the higher self just goes, delete it and move on. The path is just not for them. It's not ready. I remember William Walker Atkinson once said, he was using the pseudonym Yogi Ramacharaka, where he said, each and every one of us are exactly where we need to be in this life. And so don't scorn someone for where they are in this life, but celebrate that they even exist, and know that if they're moving towards something that maybe in a future birth, that they will have a more fortuitous life. Now, sometimes that can be easier said than done, especially when you are around a bunch of a-holes and so forth and so on, right? But to get back to my point, if you have that dog psychology, you won't take a lot of things personally, right? Someone may attack your spiritual path, attack your religion, attack your sense of spirituality, but you won't take it personally. Obviously, if someone's trying to incur harm on you physically, you need to protect yourself. That's just common sense, right? You need to act immediately and appropriately to each and every situation. That's a higher level of spirituality, right? That's why we have Zen koans. That's why we practice spiritual practices such as Hatha Yoga or Tai Chi Chuan, is to act immediately and appropriately to each and every situation. You become sort of one with the substratum. And obviously, if someone's going to punch you in the face, it's better to block, right? Instead of taking the blow. So these are all things for us to think about. Again, we are human. So you are going to be attacked for what you believe in your life, for who you are. People will attack you for anything. I've been attacked. I mean, if you have a YouTube channel, I don't recommend starting a YouTube channel, right? It's probably one of the worst things for your soul. But if you start a YouTube channel, then you'll be attacked for everything. I don't like your haircut. Just don't like your haircut. Just don't like your face. Thanks. So, it's interesting, the mental health of a lot of people. And so my perspective of that is that those people, obviously, I have a lot of mental health issues. I don't want to contribute to that. So I just need to leave them be, right? I need to leave them be. If I contribute to that, it might not be good for their health. Obviously, it's not going to be good for my mental health too, because getting into a debate about my haircut, I mean, seriously. So let's go to the next slide. Now we're talking about righteous actions, right? So if righteous actions are the limbs and their performer the body, it goes without saying that actions determine the wholeness of the body. And what is the body? The whole world. The wise say to see the body and its duties as unrelated is the crux of ignorance. Calm and cool perseverance in matters of social order and justice must be observed. Contrariwise attitudes bring only infamy. Glory and notoriety results from the motive behind the method of one's actions. all the sacred works have comprehensively presented these matters. Strict adherence with true faith and utmost loyalty to these commandments is required. Discipline at the level of the individual shall echo in the whole society. I love that last line in this verse. Discipline at the level of the individual shall echo in the whole society. One of the important things here is, be careful what you wish for, and also be mindful of your actions as well, right? And so a lot of people in the modern day sadly assume that being spiritual means being righteous. Now, from the Eastern philosophical and spiritual perspective, that is complete bonkers, because it might relate somewhat to Abrahamic faiths, but you can't superimpose the mentality of Abrahamic faiths onto the Eastern spiritual traditions. They don't fit. The idea of radical universalism is a myth, right? Which was unfortunately created a lot when the British first went to India and started to intuit the Bhagavad Gita and that through a Christian lens, right? And then we have this kind of infiltration of Christianity and other traditions in Dharma. And then you have this idea of radical universalism, like all religions are the same and so forth and so on. And no, they're not, right? And so this idea of righteousness in the Eastern spiritual traditions can be an obstacle on the path, right? And so I remember a great quote from the introduction of the I Ching, the translation by Richard Wilhelm, and it has a forward to Carl Jung on that one. There's beautiful, beautiful text, beautiful book. Difficult if you're not familiar with a lot of Taoist concepts. But Richard said that a lot of people criticize the sage, the sadhu, the siddha, the Taoist, because they're up in the cave, meditating, following their own spiritual path, uniting with the cosmos, however you want to say it, right? But what society don't realize is that they are creating incomparable human values for the future. Now, you may say that quote by Richard that's just word salad. That's just BS. Well, let's test that. Do you remember a angry politician from the year 500 BCE from that century? Do you remember that angry politician? How come you can't tell me his name? But do you remember the Buddha? Do you remember Lao Tzu, Chuang-Tzu, Shankara, Vyasa? And so these sages created incomparable human values for the future, spiritual ideals that we are all living by, right? And so we too are the same. All of us are the same. Bhagavan understood this. In the life that he lived, he created incomparable human values for the future, gave people a path to follow. Inadvertently, he wasn't setting out to do anything, right? But that's all of us. And so where that goes awry is when we become a moralist, a strict moralist, a self-righteous person. And as that quote mentioned in the Ribhu, our limbs are moving here and there and everywhere, but we're not taking care of the body, right? We're not like the body is the whole of existence, right? And so we need to embody what that last line in the Ribhu said. Our discipline will echo, not just in this immediate life, it'll echo into the future, right? And so I often say to people, particularly say, for example, if I'm conducting a tour with people or I'm conducting a private course, is that we don't really know what we're doing here, right? We can't quite quantify it. We can't add it up. But there's some sort of meaning that's happening. We're building meaning. We're building something that matters. We don't really know what that is. And I feel like we're doing that here. We're creating something that absolutely matters. It has meaning. Again, we can't quantify it. You don't want to split the atom. We don't know what that is, but we are doing that. And so, as I said, a lot of people sometimes go over the top with their righteousness, right? But if we remain calm and cool, perseverance in matters of social order and justice must be observed. So it's actually not rocket science, right? It is not rocket science. So the wise say to see the body and its duties as unrelated to the crux of ignorance. Now, that's another important thing of following the will of the ultimate, and just what is going to be in your life will be, right? You're not trying to change anything per se. Now, you might say, well, how did I get here? I could say for yourself, how did you get there as well, right? There are so many things that we can say, like, how did we do this? How did this happen? And so forth and so on. But we are here nevertheless. And for some reason, we continue to follow this path because it's easy. It's not difficult. It can feel difficult at times, right? When the society tests you, when the world tests you. But usually what happens is, and what I found with other people is that they may get tested, but then they recalibrate. So they might have a falling out at work. They might get fired. There might be something that might jeopardize their existence in some sense, and they fall off the path a little bit. But look, it's all well and good. They usually recalibrate and things pan out. Things often do pan out. Sometimes they don't pan out, but a lot of times they do, right? And so, again, that's another thing for us to think about on the spiritual path. Perform your actions with a sense of indifference. Don't be attached to the fruits of your actions. And just remember that you fundamentally are a limb of the universe. We can extend that analogy of the limbs in the body. You are a limb of the universe. I remember Alan Watts once said that we are kind of like the tip of a fractal. So if you have that kind of idea of the fractal in your mind, you got the tip of the fractal, right? And you got all of this massive fractal that fractals out. That's the Big Bang moving through you, right? Or we could change that to say that's Brahman moving through you, or the Tao moving through you. And so you are a limb of the universe. But is it your life or the universe's life? That's a fundamental thing that we need to realize. Is it really our life, or is it the universe's life? Obviously, egotistically, we don't like to hear that type of phrase because it threatens the existence of the ego. But the ego ain't going to be around for a long time. You know, the universe has been around for a long time. And as humans, we get so pumped up that we're here for 80, 90, 100 years. We get so gassed. How good's this? You know, it's only 80, 90, 100 years of the cosmos's life. It's nothing. It's not even a blink of an eye. That's just the ego thinking too much of itself, thinking too highly of itself. And so the next phase of being a spiritual aspirant, which we need to speak about from the Ribhu Gita, is it states, Shiva is pleased to bless him who relies not on fruits of destiny accrued from merits of past lives, but who fords the spiritual currents amidst the worldly tides. Such a harmonious endeavor is upheld by the scriptures, unruffled by the debate as to whether the ultimate fruit is the result of one's pious effort or divine grant. One must continue to strive in mundane and spiritual efforts. So that first line, Shiva is pleased to bless him who relies not on fruits of destiny accrued from merits of past lives, but who fords the spiritual currents amidst the worldly tides. And that last part, one must continue to strive in mundane and spiritual efforts. Now, a lot of people might think that's paradoxical. So I must strive in mundane efforts. Now, again, this is just about getting out of your own way, and allowing the will of the divine to move through you, right? As I said, is this your life or the universe's life? You are a limb of the universe. So no matter whether you are a garbage man, someone in a bank, or an idiot YouTuber, it's that will moving through you, right? And so that's what's important. It's that will that's moving through you as you doing you, which the ego tries to make claim, right? And so we will get to, in a second, the idea of free will versus divine will and the importance of surrender. But that's also something for us to remember, right? Is not being attached to those fruits. We often are attached to the fruits of our own labor. And one analogy I like to use for attachment and being unattached is the idea of weight. Now, it doesn't really just relate to attachment and unattachment, right? But if we look at enlightenment, for example, from the perspective of weight. So when your time comes to pass, if you are attached to many things from your life, from your lifespan, right? You're attached to not only things, but people, ideas you have in your head, the conditioning you've been embodied. There's a certain weight to that. So if we use that as a gravity analogy, when your life comes to pass and you go into the Bardo realm, that weight pulls you straight back down into the womb. I love that analogy because the lighter you are, the more chance in the Bardo realm, so to speak, that you float off into the ultimate source of Brahman, Tao, call it whatever you may, Dhamma Dhatu, but you float off into that ultimate undifferentiated source. It's the Niguna Brahman aspect, the non-qualified aspect of Brahman, the Brahman without qualities. No guna means no qualities, right? No gunas. Saguna means with qualities. And so I love that analogy of not being bogged down by your life and continually to shed as you live your life. And the lighter you become, the greater chance there is of that sort of moksha upon death. So the idea that the Shaivas have of the moksha upon death, or even the Vajrayana Buddhists with the Bardo realm. I use the Bardo realm as an example because in the Bardo realm, I don't know if you guys know the essence of what the Bardo realm that is taught in the Tibetan Book of the Dead is that when our life comes to pass, or when we die, in air quotes, we go into the pure space, right? The pure space, you could say, of Dhamma Dhatu in Vajrayana Buddhism. And then if you've had a lot of conditioning, a lot of weight, a lot of attachment, this is obviously karma, right? This is the result of action. This is that weight that's kind of in your samskaras, in your subconscious. Samskaras are kind of like mental impressions, subliminal imprints that you've taken through life that you attach to in the basement, which come up as your karma. Your karma being your actions and your unconscious actions. Karma, in a sense, your unconscious actions is probably the worst aspect of your karma. Remember, karma comes from the Sanskrit kri, which means action. And so in the Bardo, the first phase is if you've had certain training throughout your life, right? So if you've done a lot of meditative training, you've done a lot of contemplation, you understand kind of the nature of reality. I like what Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche says. You need two aspects for this. You need recognition and stability. The recognition is that you fundamentally are that, right? And you understand that. Now that may seem completely frivolous for some people, but if you don't really understand it, if you kind of understand it on Tuesday, but by Wednesday you're back to being an atheist, you don't really understand it, right? And the other part is stability. Now the stability is just the mind that is stable and settled in that, right? So in Vajrayana Buddhism, they use the term Rigpa. Rigpa is total pristine awareness. It's like this stable mind, this equanimous mind, but you have the stability in that. And so he would say that if you cultivate these, even though these are our intrinsic nature, right? Because our nature gets warped from living, we go through education, we go through cultural training, so forth and so on. But if you cultivate these two, when you get to the next phase in the Bardo, because when you first go into the Bardo, as I said, there's that pristine nothingness, the Dhamma Dhatu. Then there's the first phase where that karma in your life, the vibration of that and the weight starts to operate. And so the second phase after that is if you've had that training, you have the recognition and the stability. So you have that awareness. Then when you're in that second phase, then you can become aware of those vibrations and they start to dissipate. And then the third phase is one or two. If you haven't had that training, the vibrations will be so strong and so attractive, and there'll be a weight to it that you'll go straight back down into a womb. The other one is if you've had the training, then you go into the ultimate source. And so that is part of that Bardo realm. And in relation to, as I said, that's kind of that gravity analogy, that it's weight. Enlightenment, in some sense, is weightless. Remember I mentioned that concept from earlier, that phrase Xiao Yao Yu by Zhuangzi, the free and easy wandering and oneness, the aimless roaming, the ease, the fundamental ease in life. Having that ease is the weightlessness. Nothing sticks. Nothing. It's just like wind. Remember I mentioned dog psychology. Yeah, you have that fundamental dog psychology, just goes through, and then we're back to sniffing butts. So this is very important and an imperative attitude of the spiritual aspirant. And like I said, it's very important to have the understanding and having that stability on the spiritual path. If you have both of those, nothing can really go wrong for you, right? And so, as they said, unruffled by the debate as to whether the ultimate fruit is a result of one's pious effort or divine grant, one must continue to strive in mundane and spiritual efforts, nevertheless, right? Nevertheless. So you've kind of got over yourself a little bit here, right? You're not debating whether, is this Shiva's will moving through me or is this me? You're just out of your way altogether. And you're just moving as a limb of the universe and doing what is required. You essentially have got out of your own way, and things are just happening effortlessly as a result. And so the last part of the spiritual aspirant section that I want to speak about before we move on to the next part is, from the ultimate standpoint, there is none other than Shiva Mahadev to grant fruits. The diverse branches of the Vedas vouchsafe various results. Such values are assigned to the practices by Shiva himself, who is the true experiencer and also the authority. So from the ultimate standpoint, there is none other than Shiva to grant fruits. This is, again, something that is fundamental on the path, right? Shiva alone exists, or Shiva here is a representation of Brahman, right? Brahman alone exists. If we understand that fundamentally, and you don't turn that into some sort of fundamentalism, you don't take that and turn that into something more than what it is, then that's all that there is. And whatever happens in your life will happen. But it doesn't mean in a sense that you stop acting altogether. As the previous verse stated, you must continue in mundane and spiritual efforts nevertheless, because you are a human being. I feel a lot of people take this knowledge and information in a very incorrect way, where they think that I heard this, so all I'm going to do is just sit, and that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to do nothing else. And if that's your response to the knowledge, I would say that you essentially have misunderstood the knowledge to a certain degree, because your life is precious. It is Shiva itself. And so whatever is your intuitive aptitude, whatever you are attracted to in that sense, you follow that path without a sense of ego, but a sense of wonder, a sense of awe, because everything is Brahman itself. Even your rejection of life, even your rejection of action is Brahman itself. Even the ignorant is Brahman itself, right? So this is the higher understanding we need to come to. The diversity of life is just the Shakti. This life is the beautified aspect of Shiva. It is the supreme beatitude of the ultimate. This is what Shakti is. But if you see it through the Maya lens, right, and you say it's this or that, then you'll get confused. If you experience it for what it is, then you'll feel a lot of bliss from the experience, right? If you look at what people would do, say, 100 years ago, for example, if you went to the UK 100 years ago, for someone to just sit down and just relax and enjoy just the life, they would sit in the backyard with a cigar and maybe a little bit of whiskey and just look at the stars. And that's all they had. They had no one around them. And then we could debate, oh, well, smoking and alcohol is not good for you, and, this and that. Again, there is no time for virtue signaling. You're missing the point, and you're trying to split the atom. It's about the experience, what they experienced back then as opposed to what we experience now. So what a lot of people experience now is they think a good time or being at peace is sitting on their couch staring at their smartphone. Which one is better or worse, right? Where you're involved in the worldly life, you're engaged in complete nonsense on the phone. Most of the things that are happening in that, you need to remember, don't even exist. Where the British guy 150 years ago or something is just sitting out looking at the stars in wonder, still with a sense of awe. Where we have our phones, we got our little stupid Wikipedia, and we think we understand the nature of reality, and we do not. We do not. Chuang-Tzu himself said that it's through the irrational sphere that we understand the nature of reality. Let that one sink in. It's through the irrational sphere that we understand the nature of reality. We cannot understand the nature of reality with rationality. As he said, you cannot reduce the universe to a logical conclusion. It's in the awe and the mystery that is the nature of reality. Rationally, we can't understand it. It'll be like scientists chasing the explanation of the universe often to infinitely in the future, which I never get to, because as Chuang-Tzu said, you have to kind of disengage from the rational sphere, so you step into the irrational, which then allows you to have the sense of Brahman or Tao. Remember, it's a sense. It's a higher sense. Now, some of us are born with what they call in esotericism the divine organ, because you might say that if we all are that, how come some people don't realize and some others do? Well, in esotericism, they talk about the divine organ. Maybe why everyone's here is that you might have a bigger divine organ through many past lifetimes. And so this is like a duct to water for you, right? This knowledge is just like a duct to water. It's natural. And so because it's natural, you continue to follow it. But you don't try and split the atom. You try to live with that sense of awe and wonder. Leave the door ajar a little bit, right? Leave the door ajar that you don't know. Because if you leave the door ajar that you don't know, then a bigger and deeper reality awaits you. Even in the Upanishads, they say, those who know the Brahman do not know the Brahman. Those who do not know the Brahman know the Brahman. So you see, that's alluding to that once you make Brahman an object of knowledge, or once you objectify the spiritual path in general, and you don't leave the door ajar and say you become a know-it-all, then you don't know it. It's in the irrational sphere. It's about following your path in a sense of awe and wonder and mystery, because life is a mystery. It's beautiful when you understand it from that perspective, right? So we need to remember, is it us doing us, or is it Shiva doing us, right? That's something that we fundamentally have to come back to. And so that first section was basically about the mentality of a spiritual aspirant and not being attached to our fruits of our own labor, right? Being able to move through life efficaciously without being attached to the fruits of our own labor doesn't mean you don't celebrate the little victories, but it means you're not attached to it, right? You might celebrate it, but life goes on. And because you're not attached, it's easily forgotten. So in Chinese, there's a word called Cheng Wang. Cheng Wang in Chinese means self-forgetting. So you want to get to the point of self-forgetting. You've even forgotten yourself because you're just moving as one with the Tao. You are moving one with the river, and you don't know who or what this vessel is. It's here, you're aware, your senses are on, and so you move as one with it. So the next section I want to talk to you about, we talked about the mentality of the spiritual aspirant as discussed in the Ribhu Gita, right? And so what we want to speak about now is about, I alluded to a little bit in that section, about having doubt. So a lot of people, like I said, on Monday, all is Brahman. On Tuesday, Brahman doesn't exist. On Wednesday, yeah, they're kind of okay with Brahman. And by Friday, they're a complete atheist, all right? And so one of the things for a spiritual aspirant is having completely no doubt that all is the fundamental oneness of reality. Do we have any doubt about that? Now, a lot of people do, because a lot of people might follow a certain path or a certain religion. But do you have doubt in that? Now, if you have doubt in that, sometimes we doubt it when we experience maybe pain in our own personal life, or maybe injustice in our own personal life, and we're not looking at the bigger picture. And a lot of the time we just need perspective. But you don't want to be too cringe about this. Like sometimes someone will say, like someone might be grieving or something like this, and then you say, oh, well, someone's doing it harder in Bangladesh. And it's like, pick your time, So you don't want to take that too far, but you need to sort of have perspective, because sometimes we get caught up in our own perspective. There's actually a Sanskrit word called drishti, right? And drishti can mean sort of like subjective perspective. So we get caught in our own subjective perspective, and we think that what is happening to us is all and everything. And so we get so angry, or we experience so much joy, or, either or, essentially because we're attached to ourselves, right? And we haven't had the Cheng Wang, we haven't had the self-forgetting. And so it's hard to step out of our way a little bit. But if you don't have any doubt, you allow your life to just move as it will. You are that leaf moving down the river, and the river's power becomes your power, to use the Taoist analogy. And so in saying that, the Ribhu states, beware. A systematic study of the sacred text by itself cannot put an end to the doubter. Doubts cease only to the recipient of Shiva's grace. The intelligence one resorts not to his intelligence, but to Shiva's grace for the comprehension of the sacred utterances. The Lord is of the nature described in the text and beyond them. So this is important. Even though we are studying the scriptures, right? If you have doubt, then these texts mean nothing to you. The teachings of Bhagavan mean nothing to you if you have that doubt. So a systematic study of the texts, abiding by Bhagavan's words, they will not do anything for you if you doubt the knowledge. And so, as Ribhu states here, doubts cease only to the recipient of Shiva's grace. I've got a whole video on Kripa, right? Kripa is kind of this divine grace that we find in India. And so you'll see Kripa a lot around, especially the tradition of Hare Krishnaism, Vaishnavism. Well, Hare Krishnaism is a form of Vaishnavism. And so there's a lot of focus on devotion, on grace, but that also exists also within Shaivism. And so in that video, I spoke about Kripa and I spoke about why some experience the grace of Shiva and some don't, right? And so what they say in the text is it comes a lot back to karma, right? It comes back to past lives. It comes back to those who have their divine organ is ready for this knowledge. Now, we don't know why some have that and some don't. Just some people probably in their life and past lives got swept up with a lot of things that were happening in their life, a lot of worldliness, a lot of worldly things that were inhibiting their spiritual path. So there is that problem, and we've all experienced that in our past lives, right? And maybe this life, your divine organ is fully open and you are ready to receive the grace. And you've kind of let go of yourself. You've gone through a process of self-forgetting, Changwang, and you're just absorbed in Shiva's grace. You're absorbed in the ultimate. And whatever happens in your life will happen, but you are not doubting the experience because it is what it is. And it's a funny thing, like even if you look at it from a generic perspective, even if you do doubt the experience, everything still is what it is. You can't change what happened. You can't alter the past. And so all we can do is move into the present, which then affects the future, right? And so a lot of our karmic debt comes from not letting go of the past. And so we accrue more karma because things have happened to us in the past and we hold on to it, right? Sometimes we play the victim, or sometimes we want attention from others because we've had some certain injustice in our life or we've been hard done by. But that affects our present, which then affects our future. And so if you have a form of self-forgetting, if you have a form of awareness of that, this past karmic debt is something I'm going to have to continually pay it forward if I don't deal with it in the present, right? And so the letting go process is highly needed to move forward on the spiritual path. And so one way to do that is in having no doubt. Now, for example, if you wanted to learn the Brahma Vidya, right, the knowledge of Brahman back in the ancient days, you would go to a Gurukul, right? A Gurukul is like a school where you would learn from the Swamis the knowledge of Brahman, the Brahma Vidya, and it would usually only be for those who had that aptitude. And they would only usually teach people before 30. They wouldn't teach anyone after 30 because the idea that we're too sort of hardwired in our habits and our way of thinking after 30, which is, it's very perceptive. But you would only be able to learn the Brahma Vidya if you had no doubt and your spiritual organ was completely open. If you had doubt, you would not even be accepted. First of all, you wouldn't go, right? You'd be more interested in being a car salesman or what have you. They didn't have cars back in the Vedic period, but maybe a horse and carriage salesman, let's say. And so that's where doubt can inhibit our path. We are constantly doubt, and we constantly doubt ourselves, right? One of the fundamental things is we doubt ourselves because we don't believe in ourselves fundamentally. Now, the knowledge that we're learning today, the knowledge of the great scriptures, the Brahma Vidya, the knowledge of Brahman itself, is to actually help you love yourself and not doubt yourself. Now, I'm not talking on a sort of egotistical level here, but I'm saying like doubt the existence of yourself, just the fundamental existence of yourself, the sat, right? You exist. And so you are that truth, but it's an acknowledgement and an acceptance and not having doubt in that. And so I think a lot of us just fundamentally doubt ourselves. So if we doubt ourselves, what happens then? We doubt everything else. I can give you the greatest text in the world. I can tell you some of Bhagavan's teachings, some of Lao Tzu's teachings, the Buddha's teachings, and it'll all be just nonsense to you because you doubt yourself. So if you doubt yourself, how can you trust anything else? And so these teachings are about, again, having that trust and trusting yourself, which allows you to trust the knowledge. And so we shan't live with doubt if we're going to progress on the spiritual path. Any spiritual aspirant that has doubt is not going to go too far. Ribhu states further, should mutually conflicting descriptions appear in the text, they must be understood in their proper context without giving room for controversy. The truth of Brahman furnished in them is of a transcendental nature and does not conform to the worldly standards. All the descriptive utterances, be even of enlightened ones, are only signposts of that which eschews the very root of description, the mind. So the man of discrimination, deriving guidance, succor, and courage from the sacred law, strives to transcend his own mind, himself, the designer of all ideas of difference, and thereby experiences Shivam, the true self. Shivam here is the fundamental sound of Shiva, the fundamental essence of Brahman itself. And this is a very important quote by Ribhu here. The importance of transcending our own mind, our own doubts, so we can experience the ultimate reality, right? And so I like how they use Shivam here, because like the reverberation of the ultimate that moves through you, like alluding to some sort of subtle transcendental sound. And so, like I said earlier, you will find conflicting descriptions within the text. You'll find sometimes they flip-flop between like Shakti, illusion, and so forth and so on. And if you understand it in its proper context, as this verse states, it won't give room for controversy. It's in transcending that doubt, transcending the mind that produces the doubt, that we experience Shiva itself, that we experience that undifferentiated consciousness. As you guys know, especially you mainstays that have been around for many years, the differences between like a jiva, a ego persona system on an individual level, and the ultimate reality is this state of consciousness between differentiation and undifferentiated. So the ultimate substratum of Brahman is completely undifferentiated. The state of consciousness for the jiva is completely differentiated. The mind is riddled with opinions, likes and dislikes, ideologies, so forth and so on. Hate, love, think of any opposites. It's riddled with that. It's once we tend to the mind and we realize that we are ultimately that, we are the Atman within us, the undifferentiated consciousness is identical with Brahman. The jiva is what eclipses that. It's the dirty window that doesn't allow the clear, pristine rays of the sun to shine through. And so we are obviously, most of the time for most people, working through that jiva. We are operating in reality through Maya. And so we think it's this and that, and it's not really this and that, right? And so if we had steadfast, no doubt that all is Brahman, then that's what begins to kind of uproot the mind. Bhagavan once said that if you want to burn out all your vasanas, right? Your vasanas are the latent tendencies and habitual ways. If you want to burn all of those out, you just need to surrender and have no doubt in the ultimate. It's one of the greatest ways to do it. Bhakti Marga, right? Bhakti Marga is the path of surrender, the path of devotion to the ultimate. Because you're constantly just giving things away, not physical things, but giving the mentality of the habit of the mind and the vasanas that you have, you're constantly just throwing them on the fire of Shiva. A vasana can be described this way, right? You've done something to me. Say you were running past me and you stood on my foot. And so every time after that someone runs past me, I have a reaction that person's going to stand on my foot. So I'm reacting each time to that situation in the same way. And so that's what a vasana is. And so I'm not seeing each and every situation in their truest context. And so that's what we do on a psychological level all the time, right? Someone might treat you bad, and then you might have a similar experience with someone else, someone completely different. I say, didn't even know that person, but you reacted to it in the same way. And that's what a vasana is. And so if you want to root out the ego, as Bhagavan said, you grab that vasana in that moment and you put it on the fire of Shiva, and you just react. You try and react immediately and appropriately to each and every situation without past karmic debt affecting the present. Now, easier said than done, right? Easier said than done. It's not to say that sometimes that karmic debt of the past was not useful in the present, but we would have to say 99.999% of the time it was not useful, and it was not exactly the same situation as the past. And so if we have that trust, then we're continually throwing our vasanas on the fire. Now, what does this do? So if you look at the whole samsaric framework, the psychological framework of the East, you have karma, vasanas, samskaras. Samskaras, as I said, is the subconscious tendencies. It's the mental impressions, the subliminal imprints that we absorb all through life. Even now, what you're doing, looking around, your samskaras naturally absorb imprints. and it becomes something in the basement. Now, if it's something very frivolous, it'll remember it, but it's not anything useful. But usually painful or pleasurable experiences, fantasies, and so forth and so on become these dormant things within the basement of the samskaras. Now, in the basement, it bubbles up and it becomes your vasanas. So your vasanas are your habits and tendencies based on what's in the subconscious. And then the extension of that is karma. And so that becomes your actions and your unconscious actions, which are informed by the other two. And what reinforces the cycle, which is kind of the play of samsara, is that you're out there acting unconsciously and consciously in the same way that you had before that caused the negative samskaras, which continues to reinforce negative samskaras. And so the whole cycle continues. And so the reason we study these scriptures, part of the reason, and we practice sincere meditation, so forth and so on, is to put that cycle in reverse. So you work on your actions and your unconscious actions, which affects your vasanas, which begins to burn those vasanas. And then you get the removalist over and you begin to empty the basement. And the ultimate removalist is Shiva itself. So Shiva comes over and starts to remove this stuff out of the basement because you've surrendered your action, which has affected your habits and tendencies, which affects you on a fundamental deep level. Once your basement is empty, the ananda is in the basement. The ananda, the bliss, the unassociated bliss is in there. But you thought the ananda was in your vasanas and your karma. You thought that you could go around and have bliss based on what you're experiencing, your conditioning. And then we sort of are on that hedonic treadmill. And unfortunately, a lot of modern life is favorable to the hedonic treadmill. And so we're all on this hedonic treadmill. We're chasing pleasures. We're chasing fame. We're chasing frivolous joy, temporary joy and happiness. And then we wonder why people are fundamentally sick and unhappy. And so moving on, it is desirable to achieve certitude in the supremacy of Shiva through texts, but it is not sufficient to be content with that, holding certain attitudes towards him, even if as divine. He is all transcending. Mere scholarship does not reveal him. Sages have proclaimed that the experience of Shivam is unique, and the scriptural revelations provide, at best, a distant echo or a hazy outline of that. The scriptures are very important, obviously, to read these on the path. But you don't want to then become, in some sense, a fundamentalist about it. This is, again, a problem in many religions. People become fundamentalists about certain books or certain teachers and this and that. And fundamentalism itself is a trick of the ego, right? Because you've bought into wholeheartedly a framework that you think is the framework, and then you can be violent to others for that reason, right? That's where fundamentalism is born. Like I said to you guys earlier, leave the door ajar a little bit. Allow sometimes other traditions, other ideas to come in, which will enrich your path and allow you to be a bit more free on your path too. Like you won't be so rigid. And so you read the scriptures not for scholarship, but because you love them and because it enriches your path, it enriches your spiritual practice, it enriches your life. A lot of people ask me, they say, because I've been doing this for a long time, like what has been the most significant book, meditation I've done, so forth and so on. And no, none of that. Ordinary life, greatest teacher in the world, ordinary life. And they think, why? But if you have a spiritual aptitude and you live life, you learn so much from just observing life. Like I've been to India, I can't even name the amount of times, hundreds of times, right? Spent many years there. And I've learned more from the people and the environment in a lot of sense than I had from the scriptures and the teachers. I'm not making a sort of a competition here, or I don't want you to over exaggerate what I'm saying, but I have learned a lot, almost more than I have from everything else. And there's a lot to say when you step out of your uncomfortable environment and you embrace life. Because first of all, you have to get out of your ego. So my Australian ego, right, doesn't exist. It can't exist in India. If it tries to exist in India, it gets back on a plane and it goes back to Australia to its comfortable environment. You have to let go. You're not going to survive. It's a completely different environment. And vice versa, if an Indian goes to Australia, an Indian has to also let go. And so you can learn a lot just from life itself. And what that does also is it keeps you grounded and keeps you human. I see a lot of people a lot of the time, and I alluded to this earlier, who get so vexed about transcending the human that they become overly moralist or they become a complete hypocrite. And there's a negative downfall to this, right? You got to remember that someone like Bhagavan was very human. He laughed a lot. There was a lot of jokes in the ashram. It wasn't all just, who am I, who am I, who am I? Who am I? Atma Vichara, as I've explained in many videos, that gets people triggered, is a preliminary stage to the ultimate silence that Bhagavan had embodied. And when I'm saying silence here, I'm not just talking about shutting your yap. I'm talking about having that equanimity of mind. That's the silence that Bhagavan was talking about. He could act immediately and appropriately to each and every situation, but was perfectly equanimous. It wasn't just about shutting your yap. It's about having that equanimity of mind. If you don't have that equanimity of mind, shutting your yap's pretty pointless because your mind is still on the hamster wheel. And so, again, more things for us to think about, right? More things for us to think about when we look at that verse. And so, again, not becoming a complete book nerd, using the scriptures, using any book as a guide and something to deepen your understanding of the ultimate is what they're for. If you're a professor or something in university on this knowledge, but maybe that's your path, right? But I'm saying it from this context is you don't ever want to go down that alley where you do philosophy rather than live it. Once we start doing philosophy, that's where all problems arise from, because we are using the spiritual traditions then as an object rather than a living tradition. And everything that we are doing here is we're embodying a living tradition. We're trying not to make it an object of knowledge. The scriptures, the spiritual practices, and everything is about embodying that living tradition, spiritual tradition that goes back to the Sapta Rishis, right? Goes back to the Vedas, goes back to an oral tradition before it became a written tradition. So the next one, Param Shiva is the bestower of release for devotees. The heart knot is rendered void by his grace. Textual revelation and devotees' experience are the testimony to this. So long as the vital airs take firm hold of the body, there is no liberation through Ishvara, the Sabda Brahman. At the time of the dissolution of body, as the vital airs take a reverse course, the distinction between the meditator and the goal dissolves, and the fruit thereof is said to be enjoyed by Param Shiva. And again, you might see a paradox here. Textual revelation and devotees' experience are the testimony to this. So again, we had a verse then talking about scholarship, don't do scholarship, but then textual revelation is important. So sometimes you see these contradictions, but it's not really a contradiction when you understand from a deeper level. See, again, we take things in an either-or mentality in the modern day. Oh, so we shouldn't read books. No, it's not what's being said. You don't become a book nerd and this and that. You follow the scriptures, you read them for the textual revelation that is important for your spiritual path. And so that's important on the transmigration of the soul, right? And so if you followed the path sincerely, as I mentioned with the Bardo realm, right? If you followed the path sincerely, then the reverse course of the vital airs they use, Ribhu uses in this verse, you begin to become one with Shiva itself, right? But this can actually happen while living. Ribhu does say this, obviously, in the Ribhu Gita as well. Again, in these texts, we speak about everything, right? They speak about everything. So Ribhu is mentioning this, in a sense, like on the cusp of death. But to become a Jivan Mukta, someone liberated while living, like Bhagavan, is that the reverse of the vital airs is to become one with Parashiva himself, become one with Shiva, Brahman, right? And so that's what's important on the path. So textual revelation, spiritual practice, and all of this, we could say a means to the end, right? We are that already now. But what's beautiful is the constant remembering of that too, right? It's the constant remembering of that. And so that's why we follow the spiritual path, because particularly in the Kali Yuga, which we live, is that there's a constant forgetting of that. That's why avidya is here. That's why there is the ignorance of Brahman. And so the reason why you read the text, you meditate, you follow this path, it not only gives you a purpose, but you are remembering what you truly are, as opposed to continually forgetting what you truly are. You might have a loved one or a friend, right, who are following the path of avidya. They are following the knowledge of avidya, which is the knowledge of the Kali Yuga, the knowledge of materialism is the only reality. So the material world is all that exists, We have institutions that reflect this, right? A lot of science is materially driven. And so they go down a certain different path and then they suffer accordingly. Where the self-remembering, the constant remembering of Brahman, the following your own path, is in a sense an indication that you have no doubt. And you're studying the scriptures, you're meditating all the time because you are embraced in the glory of that. What's better than that? Is watching Netflix better than that? Not that watching Netflix is bad, too. You don't want to make it a good or bad dichotomy. But I think a lot of particularly New Age spiritualists become hypocrites because they say, oh, you still read books, you still meditate. And what do you do at night? You binge watch a whole season on Netflix. So who's more sincere? We know who, right? And so never let anyone try to talk you down, try to criticize you for your love for spirituality. If you don't have a love for spirituality, if you don't have that bodhicitta, that eagerness, that enthusiasm for the spiritual path, you won't go anywhere. You might become a neo-Advaitin who says, oh, I am that, and then you go around and you abuse people all day and get online and troll people and this and that. And, again, as Chuang-Tzu and Lao Tzu said in Taoism, spiritual hypocrisy is rife in the world. You've got all these people acting pious, pretending they walk on clouds, but they are the first ones you need to be careful of. So the last part of this section of having no doubt before we move into the next section is the chosen devotee who is recipient of union with self while alive, with the immaculate grace of Shiva of perfect glory, the unmodified in one's own self, cognizes everything as Shiva and not as other. Just as curd is a variant of milk, even so the elemental space full of objects is a manifestation of the supreme space transcendence. Thus Shiva and the Shaivite are non-different. That's beautiful, right? The Shiva and the Shaivite. So the spiritual aspirant that you are non-different from Brahman, Shiva, the ultimate, right? You are non-different, as Ribhu uses that curd and milk analogy, right? So this again comes back to seeing reality as Shiva itself, Brahman itself. And for those mainstays on my channel, I've constantly always said that mantra I learned where you walk around in your mind, you don't want to say it and appear as a crazy person, but if you're walking around the city or your neighborhood or so forth and so on, it's a mantra, it's a repetitive mantra. All is Brahman and I am that. All is Brahman and I am that. And you can take this actually a step further and just say all is Brahman. All is Brahman. Because if you just say all is Brahman, you're taking yourself out of the equation. And so the more you take yourself out of the equation, the easier it is to see, as Ribhu said, Shivam, right? It's easier to see the true nature of reality. And so it's that perception, seeing through Maya, which leads us to ultimate liberation while living. But it's in a lot of sense, if we haven't let go, we're not going to receive that ultimate grace. Because to receive the grace, you have to surrender, right? And so you have to surrender yourself humbly to the fire of Shiva. And then it's in surrendering yourself humbly to the fire of Shiva that you see through Maya and you see all is Brahman. And your whole life will be transformed. You will see through it. Hey, look at this, look at that. It's all Brahman. Look at this, Brahman. I mean, you don't want to go fully crazy. I got a friend in Tiruvannamalai, right? Tamil friend. And sometimes I'll go for a chai early in the morning after being at the ashram. And my friend will sit down and he'll go, Jason, you know what? Brahman's drinking tea. I'm talking Brahman. That's Brahman. This is Brahman. It's all Brahman. And then he'll go to work. And it's like, yeah, well, that's all true. I know. But you don't have to make the statement like that, right? But his point is that I don't know if he sees it all as Brahman, but his point is that it is all Brahman itself. And so can we get to that stage? Can we get to the stage that it's all one? Can we see it all as one? Or do we see it in its differentiated state through our subjective lens? That's when all trouble arises, right? When we see it through that subjective lens. We're going to move on to the next section of the Ribhu Gita, where Shiva explains his true nature to Ribhu. So this is the idea that you are verily Brahman, the same teaching that Bhagavan taught, right? You are verily Brahman. But here Shiva explains his true nature to Ribhu. You are Brahman indeed. You alone are the supreme guru. You are of the form of space only. Without doubt, you are Brahman. You are the truth. You are the accomplished one. You are the ancient. You are the emancipated. You are liberation. You are ever immortal. You are God. You are peaceful. You are afflictionless. You are Brahman, perfection, and you are the supreme and the ordinary. You are the nature of consciousness. You are awareness alone. You are the sovereign one. You dwell as the self alone. No doubt you are Brahman. Now, this is Shiva explaining to Ribhu our fundamental nature. And so when you read this verse, like the Sanskrit, I love the Sanskrit, and also I love the Tamil. The Tamil goes on with this a little bit more. The Sanskrit has a good balance to contrast. But what we see here is when you read this, right, you need to be thinking about yourself a little bit here, right? You are Brahman indeed. So Shiva's telling Ribhu, right, you are that. There's no doubt. You alone are the supreme guru. So you got to understand it in relation to yourself and also understand it in relation to Shiva. So Shiva itself is the supreme guru, right? Maybe, you on an egotistical level are not a supreme guru, but you as the Atman are the supreme guru because that is one with Shiva. So a lot of these texts can be negative in the hands of those who aren't spiritually adept with this type of knowledge. So if you start saying you are God and stuff like this, people actually will think that they are actually, as an ego, their fundamental substratum. But you're not that fundamental substratum as an ego. You are Brahman as Atman, right? And so I love these. These are actually 3 verses. So you are the nature of consciousness. You are awareness alone. You are the sovereign one. You dwell as the self alone. No doubt you are Brahman. So Shiva is, again, trying to remind Ribhu here that he is that. Have no doubt. Remember I said in the last section, have no doubt you are that. And so in the Ribhu, that, like I said, it can be very forceful in trying to remind you that, because it can be that older style stanza format where it's like, you are that, you are that, you are that, you are that. It's kind of like a constant meditation on the self, that you are ultimately one with that substratum of existence, the fundamental Brahman. You are one with that. There can be no doubt, is what Shiva is telling Ribhu here, right? And Ribhu passes this knowledge on to Nadaga, right? Because Nadaga is asking Ribhu, what did Shiva explain to you? And he said, get ready for this. And like I said, those type of verses, you need to read them in a meditative state. It's a type of meditation that reminds you that you are that. Now, I'm not saying you on an ego level, but you fundamentally are that. There can be no doubt about it. We all are that. But you don't want to exaggerate that, right? And you don't want to make out like you're some sort of guru or you're above other people. What I like about that verse particularly is it says, you are Brahman, perfection, and you are the supreme and the ordinary. So Brahman is within all life in an ordinary manner as well. It's supreme and ordinary. It's everything. How could it be something that it's not? Like I said earlier, spiritual aspirants often think they're above other people or think they're above being human. And that's when a lot of spiritual hypocrisy begins. And so to move on to the next verse, you are bliss. You are transcendental. You are void of everything and attributeless. You are the only one and secondless. Without doubt, you are Brahman. You are the nature of the substratum of all. You are of the nature of the light of all. You are devoid of all discrepancies of meaning. No doubt you are Brahman. You are verily Brahman, devoid of differences and devoid of mishaps, etc. You are the auspicious, lacking any differentiation. No doubt you are Brahman. So again, the reinforcement that no doubt you are Brahman, all through these 3 verses. Again, Shiva's reminding Ribhu and reminding us that you are bliss, you are that ananda. You are the nature of the substratum of all at your core, the Atman, right? You are of the nature of the light of all. You I'm talking about here, all of you, right? You are devoid of all discrepancies of me. No doubt you are Brahman. These type of reminders are very important, that we are that, always that. Even in your worst moments, you are that. Again, not you as the ego, you as the Atman, the undifferentiated consciousness. Yeah, the jiva is Shiva too, right? We can say the jiva is Shiva as well. And there are benefits of having a more pleasant jiva, obviously. Right? You don't want to have an over-the-top or arrogant jiva. You need to work on that jiva. Working on that jiva is also a life mission as well, right? Becoming a better human being is important in this world. Manners maketh the man, as the old phrase say. And a lot of spiritual aspirants, if you've traveled the world and you've done what I've done for a long time, you'll see a lot of times there are a lack of manners in a lot of spiritual aspirants. But yeah, the reminding that you are that light of all, you are bliss, you are everything. That's what you fundamentally are. That's the meditation, right? That's the meditation that gets you out of thinking about this or that, overly thinking about yourself. That's the big problem, right? Overly thinking about ourselves. And so when you recalibrate and you reorient your awareness back to Brahman and you say, you look in and you say, I am that, I'm the light of all, I'm one with that. Maybe saying I'm one with that's probably better as a preliminary stage. You obviously don't go around telling people, you know what, I'm God. And it's like, yeah, Jesus has come back here. So you don't want to go down that path, but you want to understand it in its proper context, as Shiva is teaching Ribhu here. So in saying that you're verily that, right? You are verily Brahman is the teaching. You are that. There can be no doubt about it. Doubts arise only when we believe in the experiences that we're having and we believe too much in ourselves and our own self-importance and our own conditioning and our own personal agenda, our own ideologies, etc. Right? It's an infinite regression when we start thinking about ourselves. And so what's important after this? Now, Ramana mentions this, Ribhu mentions this, this all comes from Shiva himself, right? So now we've got to get into this idea of free will versus divine will and why surrender is imperative. Now, surrender was especially imperative for Bhagavan, right? It was especially imperative for him because a lot of people would be vexed by their own personal problems, but had not given their ego to the fire of Shiva. They had not put it on the altar and just let it burn up. We continue to hold on to ourselves. This becomes the big problem. And so these teachings, we're getting into another text, which goes into Ramana Maharshi's teachings. And so this book is Be As You Are, one of my favorite books. It's edited by David Godman. And these are the teachings of Ramana Maharshi, right? And so this is one of my favorite books. The image you will see on my slide is the new cover of this. This is obviously an older cover. And so this is one of my favorite books of all time. It's a small read. It's a short read, but you get kind of a quick glimpse into not just the teachings of Ramana, but the teachings of Advaita Vedanta itself, right? Which Ramana embodied. But again, you'll see some contradictions in there for sure. You'll see some flip-flop between Kashmiri Shaivism and Advaita Vedanta. And like I said, don't get too confused by those understandings. If you understand Maya in the way that I explained, then you'll understand the so-called contradictions. It's only a contradiction to the spiritual aspirants who are new to the path and new to probably Sanskrit terminology. Now, we're talking about surrender a lot here, right? So let's have a look. The devotee says to Bhagavan, is there such a thing as free will? Bhagavan says, whose will is it? So long as there is the sense of doership, there is the sense of enjoyment of individual will. But if this sense is lost through the practice of vichara, the divine will act and guide the course of events. Fate is overcome by jnana, self-knowledge, which is beyond will and fate. Self-knowledge here, jnana, means knowledge of Atman, the knowing of the ultimate reality that Atman, the undifferentiated consciousness that you are fundamentally, is identical with Brahman. And so he mentions vichara here. Vichara is Atma vichara is self-inquiry, the inquiry into the nature of oneself. And so you don't want to exaggerate that just as the who am I. The Atma vichara is actually a consistent inquiry into the nature of your existence, actually through text and through meditation and everything. Everything that you and I are doing here is an inquiry into the nature of the self. It's not just asking the question, who am I, which has unfortunately become the way it is for neo-Advaitins. And so Bhagavan says, whose will is it, right? And this is important, right? When we get into questions of free will versus fate or divine will, if you will, if we understand the Vedanta better, then you'll understand that free will exists to the jiva. And so Ramana is talking from an absolute perspective here to the devotee. Free will according to whose will is it? Because if Brahman alone exists, it's only the will of the divine. And we all experience our own prabdha karma. Our prabdha karma is our own predestined karma, right? Throughout our life. So whatever is ordained to happen will happen, try as you may to prevent it, as Ramana once said. And so it's just the ultimate will of the divine, just moving through everyone. And so we often get carried away with our own personal will. Whose will? But you need to ask yourself sincerely, whose will is it truly, right? And so if you understand the Vedanta, if you understand the path of self-knowledge, jnana, then you'll understand it's only the will of Brahman, the only will of Shiva. And even saying will is kind of not a correct word, because we're kind of talking about this kind of the energy of this and that, but we're using will in the sense of how we understand it as a human, right? Because something is moving through us and it feels like our will. And it feels intuitively right, correct, and we do that. And that's what Bhagavan's saying here. That's how the devotee should function in the world. And so getting back to free will and divine will, right? If we understand jnana, if we understand self-knowledge, that the knowledge of Brahman itself, that Brahman alone is real, then what does that do to our free will, right? Is it free? And so there's a lot of ways to look at this. If you look at it from a to and fro perspective, so if you look at from the Taoist perspective, they would say that free will exists to a certain extent, but they would agree with Ramana in the sense that Ramana would also say free will exists to the extent that you are the one who is performing the actions, but it's still informed by the ultimate, and the results of those actions is still also preordained, right? And so you don't want to start then getting into like, well, if my will doesn't exist, I'm just not going to do nothing. I'm not going to do anything. And so that's where you've got it wrong, because as Taoism state and as Ramana states, you still have to act, as Bhagavan said, as Ribhu said, in mundane and also spiritual efforts. But it's still that acting through you. You might think it's your free will. And that's where Eastern philosophy and spirituality, in my opinion, is superior to Western philosophy in this matter, because they're looking at it from a more subtle perspective in relation to the divine. And so the Taoist perspective, Lao Tzu and Chuang-Tzu would say, you don't have to really debate whether there's free will or divine will. You're going to act nevertheless. But if you understand it's coming from a higher place, you'll probably act more authentically in the end. And also, you will have an appreciation for the fact that free will and divine will are kind of in this sort of push and pull mentality, right? There are times in your life where you can be in a bhaya mudra and just allow life to just be as it will, and you're shanti. But there are times when you need to act, right? So for example, if your electricity and your gas bill comes in, if you have a water bill and that comes in, and you sit at home and you're in a bhaya mudra for 6 months, you bet your bottom dollar someone's going to be coming around knocking on your door. So this is the push and pull, right? But again, as I said, even that free will to pay your bills is even preordained by the divine. Maybe even you like this in a bhaya mudra, not paying your bills, is still preordained by the divine. But if you've got a clear mind, you're going to go and pay your bills, you're going to go and pay your taxes. This is just normal behavior, right? So you want to keep that mentality that even the idea of all of your actions and you even thinking that it's free will is still the will of the ultimate. And that's what Bhagavan and the Taoists, what their mentality is. So even you acting and you debating whether it's free will or not is still the ultimate will of the divine. And see, this is where, like I said, a lot of New Age spiritualists get to. If it's all Brahman, then there's no free will. And so they just sit around and they do nothing. And it's like, you've missed the point. As Ribhu stated, In mundane and spiritual matters, efforts still persist because the will of the ultimate wants to express itself in the form that you are. It wants to express itself through you. We can debate all along with our high philosophies whether free will or divine will wants to exist. But if you're busting to take a crap, right, you need to go to the toilet or you're going to crap your pants. You can sit there in a Abhaya Mudra. Well, the free will of me, I feel like a number two is coming, but who is the one that number two is happening to? And then, you fill your jocks up. So reality hits very fast in that matter, right? And so it's not even a matter of debate. It's a matter of understanding jnana. It's a matter of understanding the knowledge of Brahman, that Brahman alone exists. If Brahman alone exists, it doesn't matter what you think about free will or divine will. It's only the will of the ultimate moving through us as us. It's doing us. But you don't want to then turn that into some sort of debate, or you don't want to split the atom as to say that, look, I have control or I don't have control. Just live your life efficaciously. Understand the grace of the ultimate moving through you. And that's all you need to think. That's all you need to know, right? And once you understand that, then you live your life in a very beautiful manner. You're not then caught between this paradox of free will and divine will. You're moving as one with it. And so, like I said earlier with Tulku Ogun Rinpoche, it's the recognition as one of the two of the stability and recognition, the recognition that's important. If you have that recognition that you are that, and you're not even one with that, you are that, and that Brahman alone exists, then your life will just continue to move in an effortless way. And so the devotee next says to Ramana then, as we were just saying, so free will is a myth? Bhagavan says, free will holds the field in association with individuality. As long as individuality lasts, there is free will. All of the scriptures are based on this fact, and they advise directing the free will in the right channel. Find out to whom free will or destiny matters. Find out where they come from and abide in their source. If you do this, both of them are transcended. That is the only purpose of discussing these questions. To whom do these questions arise? Find out and be at peace. This kind of answers what we were just talking about, right? I like how Bhagavan said, free will holds the field in association with individuality. So it's an aspect that exists in the belief that you're this individual, this jiva, right? As long as individuality lasts, there is free will. And so that's something for us to think about. As long as it lasts, there is free will, right? And so find out to whom free will or destiny matters. And so like what we were mentioning before, this idea, the idea of the jiva, see how I said the idea of the jiva. Jiva doesn't exist from the ultimate perspective, right? So this idea of the jiva and our belief in it is what kind of reinforces this hypnosis that free will exists. As you start to peel layers back, you'll see things happen in your life that are completely miraculous, that there's no way that your free will could have helped that matter to eventuate. I'm saying here in the sense that your intention for your free will to make that result to happen. So the result that usually happens for us is completely out of our hands, right? And so a lot of those results will happen without our even awareness of it. And so a lot of the time when we talk about free will, sometimes when we talk about the results of our karmic action, sometimes that has the fruit that exists in it of whether the free will exists or not. Because a lot of our actions that we perform are not intended for the consequences that we experience. But when you look at it from the ultimate perspective, the actions that we perform and the results that we experience are exactly the lessons that we need to learn. And so if we sort of reorient our awareness and look at it from that perspective, then obviously Brahman alone exists. But if you're fighting your reality and you see the consequences of your actions and you fight the consequences of your actions, then you'll continually reinforce this hypnosis that free will exists. But it doesn't. Because what we experience are the lessons that we need to learn, no matter whether they are good or bad. lessons. See, a good or bad is another dichotomy in relation to our conditioning, right? Which is something that we also have to get over. They're just lessons on the path. There's not a good or a bad lesson. There are only lessons. And the ultimate, because the ultimate loves and nourishes all, but does not lord it over them. And so because it does not lord it over them, because it's impersonal, they're only there for us to experience and grow and deepen into that experience. So find out where they come from and abide in their source. If you do this, both of them are transcended. And Bhagavan finishes that part with, that is the only purpose of discussing these questions. To whom do these questions arise? Find out and be at peace. To whom do these questions arise? Like I said before, free will exists if Brahman alone exists. We would only be vexed by this question if we believed free will exists because we believe in our jiva. This is only a question of the jiva, right? The jiva has this question. I remember when I was with the teacher a long time ago, and people have probably heard me say this before, but this lady came up and asked the guru. She was vexed with a lot of moralistic principles and injustice, and the teacher said, don't be vexed by these questions. Ask yourself, does these questions take you to liberation? Now, you have to be serious, right? You're a spiritual aspirant. You're not a do-gooder. You're not a politician. Do you live with trust? Do you trust that there are people out there who are doing things that you might think about and you might think that want to happen, but they might even have a better aptitude at doing it than what you do? So why put your mind on that? Or more importantly, why allow your jiva to be absorbed with that? People often think in a recency bias. Oh, look at all these problems. What about this? What about that? The whataboutists of the world. There's like this whole religion online of the whataboutist. What about this? What about that? What about it? What about thousands and thousands of years of the same things always happening, but no one taking the spiritual responsibility to work on themselves? Just pointing the finger out at the things that they disagree with, according to their own conditioning and their own agenda, mind you. Someone else might see it and think that it's perfectly fine, which then pulls the rug from underneath a fake spiritual aspirant like that, who is really only vexed by moral principles or morality and justice, so to speak. They're not really invested in understanding the true nature that all is Brahman. If you understood the nature that all is Brahman, these questions don't arise. You wouldn't be vexed by these questions because it's not a question that goes towards liberation. Again, there are other people doing things in this matter. If you trust the nature of life and you trust the nature of Brahman itself, that things will work out. Some things happen and we can't tell or we can't understand why certain things happen. People die, unfortunately. Their life is taken early. There are brutal crimes done and this and that. It's always happened. You know what's not always happened? People who stay steadfast to the spiritual path and lead others out of the wilderness. Yeah, you get a few. There's a few here and there. But we live in a time where we can communicate with each other. We can be steadfast and sincere and honest on the spiritual path and blaze a path forward for others to follow. Are we really invested in doing that? Or do we want to become a politician? Are we so attached to our agenda, our perspective, our drishti of the world, right? Whose drishti is right? So if you're honest on the spiritual path, whose drishti is right? Whose perspective is right? That's why these teachings exist. When you understand neither is right, that it's just a drishti, that should launch you onto the spiritual path. Because whose morality is right? Muslim morality right? Christian morality right? African, European? Tell me. As Mencius said, the great Confucian sage, kind of a Taoist, right? At heart, closet Taoist. We are fundamentally good. But it's the society, it's the moral systems and this that begin to shape us and warp us and to disfigure us into this being that we become in our mind, right? And then we protect this self-image that has been curated and cultivated. And that's what causes all problems in the world. And everyone goes through it. Everyone, no matter even someone in the Amazon, they go through it to a lesser degree. There's someone who goes through the rigors of culture and education and so forth and so on. But are we as spiritual aspirants prepared to put our drishti, our perspective on the fire, and allow the will of Shiva to enlighten our path? Question that we got to ask ourselves, right? It is a big question we got to ask ourselves if we are really sincere in that. So the last part, the devotee says to Bhagavan, if what is destined to happen will happen, is there any use in prayer or effort, or should we just remain idle? Bhagavan says, there are only two ways to conquer destiny or be independent of it. One is to inquire for whom is this destiny and discover that only the ego is bound by destiny and not the self, and that the ego is non-existent. The other way is to kill the ego by completely surrendering to the Lord, by realizing one's helplessness and saying all the time, not I, but thou, O Lord, giving up all sense of I and mind and leaving it to the Lord to do what he likes with you. Surrender can never be regarded as complete so long as the devotee wants this or that from the Lord. True surrender is love of God for the sake of love and nothing else, not even for the sake of liberation. In other words, complete effacement of the ego is necessary to conquer destiny, whether you achieve this effacement through self-inquiry or through bhakti marga. Now, bhakti marga, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of the surrender to the ultimate and following that kind of path of devotion. And so I love this response by Ramana and the recognition that the ego is non-existent. If we understand that from an ultimate perspective, right? It's a construct, doesn't exist. As in Taoism, Taoism is a technology for deprogramming that socialization product. And the ego is a product of socialization. It truly is. So again, in other words, complete effacement of the ego is necessary to conquer destiny, whether you achieve this effacement through self-inquiry or bhakti marga. So he's given the devotee two options here, or, both together, right? The consistent self-inquiry, and as I said, self-inquiry is, what's really annoying in the modern day is you've got these teachers who teach Neo-Advaita, and it's all about the inquiry to who am I, and they've got these bug eyes and they stare like this, and it's the graft. And a lot of people do fall for it, I think, because people are yearning for spiritual knowledge and they think that that's what it is. But that's actually not what Advaita Vedanta is. That's Neo-Advaita, right? That's not honest, true Advaita. Self-inquiry is not just the who am I. It's the consistent looking within at your true nature. And through the study of the great scriptures, through meditation and so forth and so on. And so the opposite of that is bhakti marga. So bhakti marga is that complete surrender. So if you have both of these together, the consistent inquiry and also a complete surrender, this actually brings a lot of beauty to your life. Sometimes if you only follow self-inquiry, you can become very dry, flavorless, you lose your sense of humor, you become too serious, your shoulders begin to slouch forward, all of these certain things that happen when religious and spiritual people take themselves too seriously. And the knowledge becomes a crutch rather than something to liberate them, right? So you don't want to do that. You don't want it to become a crutch. You want it to liberate you from that type of hypnosis. So this is where surrender can bring a lot of beauty to your life. It can really bring a lot of beauty to your life. It really does. And so it's very important on the spiritual path to have that surrender to the ultimate. You innately are humble, right? It's one of our imperative moral virtues that get trampled on as we go through the socialization process. But what happens when you surrender is you begin to reignite that humility. You begin to reignite those innate moral virtues that we have that have been trampled on by society. And so it's in having that humility that allows you to go further on the path and allows you to accept life for what it is. Because you have surrendered, you've put your ego on the altar, the Shiva's fire, and you've allowed it to burn to ashes, which has freed you to live your life in the way that the ultimate intends for it. Not that it wasn't intending for it before, but we are in our own way from the perspective of the Jiva, right? So once that moves out of the way and we surrender ourselves, then we can live our life in a very beautiful way. And so we always have those questions, the same as the devotee, right? What is destined to happen will happen. Is there any use in prayer or effort, or should we remain idle? And as I said to you guys before, what are you going to do rather than like reading the great scriptures, being involved in spirituality, meditation? Because, for me, this is fun. This is awesome, right? This is what life's about. What's more important than that? Is getting a Hulu subscription more important than that? Is watching the latest series of Ozarks more important than that? Going to a football match more important than that? Not that there's anything wrong with any of those, but you don't want to become a spiritual hypocrite, right? You don't want to say, look, I'm that, don't need to worry about any of it anymore. I'm just going to do what I do. Why? This is beautiful, what we're doing here. Like I said, we don't really know what we're doing. We can't quite quantify what we're doing, but we're creating something with a deep meaning and following this path. There's something to it. And even all of us connecting here together, we can't quantify what it is, but you know that it exists in it. And so what could be more important than that? And so having that surrender, as Ramana said, and Ramana does state this in the last chapter of Be As You Are. The chapter is called Karma, Destiny, and Free Will. And that surrender, having that devotion and having jnana go together hand in hand. The yogas of the Bhagavad Gita, right? So we have karma, bhakti, jnana, and to another extent, raja. And so a lot of people will state that we are either one or the other. We're oriented towards one or the other. And that is true to a certain degree. But I think that the complete spiritual aspirant has all intact. They have karma, they have bhakti, they have jnana, they even have raja. So Raja Yoga is the yoga of deep meditation, which goes deeper than that. Obviously, you follow the path of Ashtanga Yoga here, as Swami Vivekananda spoke about, the 8 limbs of yoga. But the 3 traditional ones from the Bhagavad Gita, Karma Yoga, which is the yoga of action, Bhakti, the yoga of devotion, Jnana, the yoga of knowledge. If you have, especially those 3, even prior to the yoga of meditation, is you build love for the ultimate, you build sincerity through your quest of self-knowledge, and you build humility through the yoga of action. I find it funny, sometimes Guyang will say to me, we might go somewhere like Tiruvannamalai or one of these places, and then you'll see some of the devotees who are like, they've got like an unhappy look, their face is all droopy, they frown all the time, their shoulders are forward, they're not freed, it hasn't freed them, right? They've taken Advaita Vedanta and they've taken themselves and the inquiry way too seriously. And Guy will simply say to me, they need karma yoga. They need to go back to their home country and do some good, honest karma yoga. Sometimes when you go and you have to work and do all these things, you have to lower your ego. You have to go into a job you don't like. You have to work in an environment you would never naturally go to. You'd work with people who you would never usually talk to. But this can be good for you on a spiritual level. That's karma yoga. Sometimes when you're taking it too seriously, you're taking yourself too seriously, you're so self-absorbed with your own spiritual path that your shoulders go forward, you frown all the time, your face is drooping, you're unhappy. This can only make you ecstatic. That's how it is for me. And for the honest people that I've known on the path my whole life. This knowledge, what we're doing, can only liberate you and only bring more ananda, more joy, more happiness. I never understand when I go to certain spiritual places and I see particularly foreigners, they're so self-absorbed to take themselves too seriously. It's time for karma yoga, kid. It really is. Because you didn't take the knowledge in its correct manner. And everything I'm doing on this channel from a traditional basis is trying to at least teach all you guys from a traditional basis in an authentic and genuine manner. I hope you all appreciate it. Because being an unhappy spiritual aspirant is a failure. It's a failure. It really is. And so you just want to truly liberate yourself. Shankara said, jnana ultimately is the highest yoga, right? It's the highest yoga. But if you don't have bhakti or karma, Your jnana is going to be very dry and can actually become tamasic. So you have the three gunas, right, in Hinduism, from Sankhya philosophy, one of the oldest philosophies in the Hindu tradition. And so you have sattva, which is the energy of purity. You have rajas, the energy of activity. It's always moving, always active. And then you have tamas, which is the energy of inertia, laziness. And so sometimes when you're only practicing jnana and you become a spiritual aspirant who has bought into Neo-Advaita and all you do is ask the question, who am I, 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 where you become a crazy person, then that's very tamasic. And you become very stagnant. You need to bring some rajas and some sattva into your life. So always within each guna, you need to remember the other two always exist. So that devotee might have started out with sattvic energy. They might have went to Tiruvannamalai, lived in Tiruvannamalai, went to the ashram every day, but then because they don't understand the Brahma Vidya too well, they're in the bliss of being in Ramana ashram, right, around Ramana Samadhi, and a beautiful energy. But then it starts out in a very innocent sattvic level, but then it turns tamasic. And so each guna has the other two inherently within it, is what you need to understand. And so you never want to end up like that. You need to follow the path in a humanly manner. Stop the thing about like, I'm not this, none of this is real. This is not helping you on the spiritual path. Accept yourself as a human. Be radically human. Be honest. Do some karma yoga. Get real. This will humble you and allow you to dive deeper into this knowledge. So if you are an honest, decent human being and spiritual aspirant, you will never forget that you are human. That keeps you grounded. But always remember that your Atman is forever identical with Brahman. There is no separation. Now, it's just about how do you balance the two, which are really one, right? You are a human having a divine experience. And so when we understand that, we can understand life in a beautiful way. Life is joyful, man. Life is not a drag. Never forget that.